The stars bled that night, not in the way suns sometimes die quietly, collapsing into a hushed ember at the end of a noble life, but in a way that stained the void with a scarlet tide, each drop a funeral pyre for the worlds that had once turned beneath them. Vast nebulae, once radiant with creation, now burned with the rust-red hue of endless wars. And above it all, the drums. They were not of matter nor of machine, but a pounding in the soul, a rhythm of death and promise. Those who heard it could never unhear it. The galaxy was not merely at war, it was at feast. Empires that had once ruled with law or mercy lay shattered, their banners trampled into the muck. The great thrones of ages past, some carved from stone, some forged of steel, some built from the bones of those who once defied their kings, stood empty, or worse, were claimed by those who needed no throne to rule. Blood slicked the steps of every palace, from the frozen citadels of the Outer Rim to the molten halls of the Forge Worlds. And in the heart of one such battlefield stood a man. He was clad in armor blackened by fire and ringed with brass, as though the metal itself had drunk too deeply of slaughter. His helm was fixed beneath one arm, the other gripping a great cleaver of serrated teeth that dripped with fresh red. The ground at his feet was soft, not from soil, but from the churn of bodies beneath his boots. Around him, the air was thick with the stench of iron and the hiss of cooling blood. They called him Cael Vortanis, once a name sung in praise by those he defended. A general who had led the legions of the Targessian Empire across 1,000 stars. He had known honor once, true, hard-won honor, the kind that tasted of sacrifice and sleepless nights. He had commanded with justice, spoken with reason, and fought not for his own glory, but for the peace of the empire that had given him life. But that was before the blood god's shadow had found him. And now there was no peace, only the endless, ravenous hunger for more. Cael did not know when the drums had first entered his dreams, only that once they had, nothing else mattered. They were the heartbeat of the cosmos, and they demanded one thing alone: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. My dear listener, before we journey deeper into this nightmarish path of brass and bone, know this: we truly love and care for you. Across all the stars of this galaxy, across every empire and every battlefield, your presence here is valued. Before we begin the story in earnest, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, settle into the shadows with me, and let us begin. The battle that had just ended was not a victory, it was a harvest. Cael's warband moved among the fallen stripping armor, taking heads, stacking them in neat pyramids that reached higher than a man's chest. This was no mindless cruelty, this was tribute. Each skull was an offering to Khorne, each gurgling last breath a coin in the endless tithe to a god who did not know mercy. Once, Cael would have wept to see his captains tearing trophies from the dead like carrion birds. But now he felt only a strange, hollow calm. That calm cracked, however, when he saw two of his captains turn their blades not on the enemy, but on each other. It began with a single shove, blood-slick gauntlets striking steel plate. Then the roars came, and within moments they were hacking and screaming, the gathered warriors forming a crude circle around them. To spill blood here, even of one's own brother in arms, was no sin. In fact, it was holy. Khorne cared not from whence the blood flowed, only that it did. Cael did not intervene. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. These were men he had once handpicked for loyalty and discipline. Now, They were hounds fighting over scraps, desperate for the blood god's gaze to fall upon them. One went down with a howl, his head rolling in the dirt moments later. The other raised the severed prize high, roaring Khorne's name, his voice carried on the wind like a war trumpet. Khal felt the echo of that roar in his own chest. And yet, there was something else there. Something that had no place in the heart of a servant of Khorne. Doubt. It struck him in that moment, not as a sudden blow, but as a long-forgotten ache, that there had been a time when his captains would have died for one another without hesitation. That battles had been fought for the preservation of life, not its wholesale annihilation. That loyalty had been worth more than a skull on a throne far away. He turned away before the victor could meet his gaze. This was not weakness, this was memory. And memory, Khal told himself, was as dangerous as any enemy blade. The sky above the battlefield was the color of dried blood, the clouds churning in unnatural spirals. Somewhere far beyond them, in the immensity of the warp, Khal knew the gaze of Khorne was fixed upon this world. Every slaughter brought the god closer. Every battle was a summons. A figure approached through the haze. It was Tarin's soul, Khal's oldest companion, a man who had marched beside him through campaigns long before the blood god had whispered his name. Tarin's armor bore the same brass trimmings, the same marks of devotion to Khorne, but his eyes still held something rare among their kind, clarity. "You let them fight," Tarin said, voice low, more observation than accusation. "It pleased the Lord of Battle," Khal replied. "It pleased him," Tarin said. "But did it please you?" Khal said nothing. The question lingered between them like a drawn blade. In the days to come, Khal would dream of his friend's words. He would remember the way Tarin's gaze had cut through the smoke and gore, seeing something in him that Khal himself could not, or would not, acknowledge. But for now, there was only the road ahead. Paved in the dead, the warband moved on, their banners trailing in the wind, each stained so deeply with blood that no cleansing could ever restore their colors. Khal mounted his war beast, the great armored monstrosity snorting steam through vents in its brass-plated skull, and looked to the horizon. There the sky split with the fire of another war, another world to conquer, another river to turn red. Yet somewhere in the deepest part of his mind, a thought whispered, a thought he dared not name, for to do so would be to betray his god. Is there an end to this? That night, as his warriors slept beneath the shadow of the piled skulls, Khal stood watch alone. The drums still pounded in his head, but now they seemed slower, heavier, as though echoing from a great distance. In that lull, a memory surfaced, the sound of children laughing in the streets of his homeworld, the warmth of sunlight that had never been tainted by the stink of blood. He clenched his fists until the gauntlets groaned. When dawn came, it was not sunlight that greeted him, but the crimson glare of a world already burning. And so, he set his warband marching once again, deeper into the service of a god who would never let them rest. The first seeds of doubt had been sown. They would grow in time, watered by betrayal and fed by the ashes of those he had once called brother. But for now, Khal Vortanis was still a champion of the blood god, and the galaxy still trembled beneath the weight of his stride. Khal Vortanis had not been born with blood on his hands. Before the days of brass and bone, before the endless rivers of red, he had stood in the sunlight of the Targessian Empire, its marble cities gleaming white against skies so clear that they seemed to go on forever. He had been the son of a soldier, the brother of a scholar, the husband of a woman whose laughter could silence his darkest moods. The scent of salt air from the coast, the distant sound of gulls, the shimmer of sun on polished armor. These had been the things that shaped him. He had sworn his first oath at 23 standard years of age, not to a god, but to an emperor. The Targessian emperor's court was not without its politics, its shadows, its ambitions, but Karl had believed in the dream of unity, in the idea that 1,000 systems could stand together under one law, one peace, one banner. He had fought for that dream across 2 decades of service, and then came the war that ended it. The Aurelian Scourge, they called it, a brutal campaign against a coalition of Outer Rim raiders and rogue machine forges. For 7 years, Karl commanded fleets in that war, winning battles that should have been unwinnable, defending worlds that should have fallen. Yet every victory came at a cost measured in thousands of lives. It was in the 7th year, on the frozen plains of Harridan IV, that the first whispers came. The siege had been long, too long. Karl's forces were outnumbered, half frozen, their supplies dwindling. The enemy had dug in deep, fortified behind lines of steel and snow, their war engines firing day and night. Karl had gone without sleep for days, walking the lines, speaking with the wounded, rallying the weary. On the 8th night, as the auroras burned red in the sky above, Karl stood alone in the command tent. Maps sprawled before him, ink bleeding from the moisture of his breath. He knew that without a miracle, they would all be dead before the week's end. That was when the drums began. They were faint at first, like the distant echo of a heartbeat, then stronger, louder. The canvas walls seemed to tremble with them. He looked up, but there was no one there. A voice followed, not a whisper, not a shout, but something that spoke directly into his bones. You could win. Karl's hand had gone instinctively to his sword hilt. Who speaks? You could win, Kelvotanis. Not in months, not in weeks. Tonight. I have no pact with the warp, Karl growled. Speak your name or be gone. The voice was a growl and a laugh in one. I am war. I am victory. I am the tide that drowns all thrones. Offer me what is mine, and I will give you the world. The air in the tent thickened, hot despite the frost outside. Karl's breath came in ragged steam. And what is yours? Blood, skulls, the tribute of the fallen, no matter whose. Give them to me, and Harridan IV will be yours by dawn. It was madness. He knew it. The Lectitio Divinitatus had warned for centuries against the whispers of the warp. Yet there, surrounded by the cold certainty of defeat, madness began to look like salvation. Kyle hesitated only a moment longer. Then he nodded. If this is the only path to save my men, so be it. The drums roared in triumph. Then kill them all. The battle that followed was unlike any Kyle had fought before. He led the assault personally, his blade cutting through enemy lines as if guided by unseen hands. His men fought with a frenzy they had never known. Their exhaustion burned away in the furnace of slaughter. The enemy was driven back, their machines shattered, their fortresses torn open. By dawn, Harridan IV was his. But so too was something else. In the days after the siege, Kyle began to notice changes. Not in his body, not yet, but in his mind. The drums would return at night, faint but constant. Sometimes he would hear the voice again, offering counsel, demanding tribute. He told himself it was nothing, the stress of war, the echo of victory. But then came the second offering. Months later, in the reclaimed halls of the Targessian capital, Karl was summoned to the Emperor's court. The war had been won on paper. In truth, the empire was exhausted, its coffers empty, its fleet scattered. The emperor thanked Khorne for his service, for saving countless worlds, yet he also reprimanded him. The slaughter at Harridan IV was excessive, the emperor said, voice echoing through the marble chamber. There were no prisoners, no quarter, even for those who surrendered. Khorne had no answer. He could not explain that in that moment, with the blood god watching, mercy had felt like treason. It was Tarin's soul who found him later in the officers' cloisters, staring at the carved reliefs of ancient victories. Tarin had fought at his side for 2 decades, a brother in all but blood. "You've changed," Tarin said simply. "War changes all of us," Khorne replied. "This isn't the war," Tarin said. "This is something else. I've heard the way you fight now, like it's not enough to win, like you need to destroy." Khorne turned to him. "If I hadn't fought that way, Harridan IV would have fallen. We would all be dead. Is that what you wanted?" Tarin's eyes darkened. "I wanted my friend to come back from the war." In the months that followed, the drums grew louder. Sometimes Khorne would wake in the night with his hands clenched, as if gripping a blade. Once, he awoke to find he had drawn it in his sleep. The voice came again during the campaign to pacify the Rillen rebellion. "Give me another offering," it said, as Khorne's forces encircled the rebel stronghold. "This time, let it be yours, one you trust, one you love. Their skull will please me more than 100 enemies." Khorne recoiled. "No, you already serve me. You already kill in my name. Do not pretend your hands are clean." That night, he could not sleep. He looked across the campfire at Tarin, who was sharpening his blade, and wondered if the blood god truly demanded his friend's death, or if the thought was only his own weakness taking root. The next morning, Khorne led the final assault. The rebels died to the last, their skulls taken, their blood staining the earth. Tarin survived. Khorne told himself that was proof of his will, that he could still defy the voice. But deep down, he knew that the second offering had been made, not in the form of Tarin's death, but in the acceptance that slaughter was no longer just a means to an end. It was the end. By the end of the Rillen campaign, Khorne was no longer the same man who had once stood beneath the sunlit skies of Targesia. He wore armor now etched with symbols he could not name, yet which felt like old friends. His banners were no longer white and gold, but deep crimson. His men chanted words they had never learned from any human tongue. The emperor still praised his victories, but Khorne noticed that the court's marble halls seemed colder now, the courtiers' eyes more guarded when they looked upon him. The priests spoke blessings in his presence, yet crossed themselves when his back was turned. Only Tarin still spoke to him as before, though even that was changing. Khorne saw the doubt in his friend's eyes, the wariness in his voice. One night, as they camped on the ashes of a burned-out city, Tarin said quietly, "There's a road you're walking, Khorne. I don't know where it ends, but I don't think you'll like it when you get there." Khorne stared into the fire. The drums were faint that night, but still present. "I know where it ends," he said, and in his heart he knew it was true. The night over Cadian soil was no true night, for the stars were shrouded in the perpetual bruise of war. Ash drifted like snow over the broken manufactorums, settling into the wounds of the land and the lungs of those who still drew breath. It was here, amidst the ruins of a city whose name had already been half forgotten, that Commissar Erathius met the one who would forever alter the course of his regiment's march. They called her the Ash Seer, a woman whose eyes were the colour of dying coals, whose robes had once been ecclesiastical white, but were now stained with the soot of countless pyres. She stood at the edge of a shattered parade ground, the wind pulling her garments like tattered banners. She did not kneel when the commissar approached, an omission that would have cost anyone else their life, but instead she inclined her head, just enough to mark the line between insolence and prophecy. "You march them to their deaths," she said, her voice carrying over the wind, as though it was not meant for his ears alone. "And yet their deaths will not matter unless you bind them in covenant." Erathius was a man of duty, forged in the black iron of Cadian law and discipline. He had no time for riddles, yet the air around her carried something heavier than superstition. Perhaps as it was the fact that her hands were wrapped, not in cloth, but in prayer scrolls burned at the edges, each one bearing fragments of scripture rewritten in a language he did not know. "What covenant?" he asked, his hand still resting on the holster of his bolt pistol. She stepped closer, her shadow mingling with his in the ash. "One that will outlast your names, your victories, even your emperor. One forged not in gold or honor, but in blood, soil, and fire." She looked past him to the rows of soldiers who waited in silent formation. "They will fight, and they will fall. But if you bind them now, their march will never end." Erathius knew enough of war to recognize the hunger in her words. It was not the hunger for survival, but for meaning, the kind of meaning that fed on the bones of the fallen. "What would this binding cost me?" he asked. The Ashseer smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Only the truth you hide even from yourself." The ritual was not sanctioned by any creed of the Imperium. It was a thing older than the Schola, older than Cadia itself. The regiment was gathered in a broken amphitheatre, its stone cracked by shellfire, its seats half buried beneath the remains of collapsed hab blocks. In the centre stood a brazier, its flames pale and unnatural, fed by the seer's powders and oils. One by one, the soldiers stepped forward, removing their helms and baring their faces to the heat. The seer marked each brow with the ash of the pyres, murmuring in that same alien tongue. Erathius himself stood among them, feeling the powder bite into his skin like frost. When the last soldier had been marked, the seer raised her arms to the dark sky. "By the covenant of ashes let no grave hold you. Let no memory fade you. Let no victory silence you." The wind rose suddenly, swirling the ash into a great spiral above their heads. Erathius swore he heard voices in it, familiar voices, belonging to those who had already fallen in the endless war. Some soldiers trembled, others stood straighter, as if the voices had poured steel into their spines. From that night on, the regiment changed. They still bled, they still died, but the deaths no longer felt final. There were moments in the thick of battle when Erathius would glance at a soldier he knew had been struck down weeks before, and see him there again, fighting without hesitation. The veterans whispered that the Covenant had unshackled them from the tally of the dead. It was a gift and a curse. The seer remained at the regiment's side, though she spoke little. At times, Erathius caught her staring toward the horizon, as though she could see something approaching, something far greater than the enemies they fought. On the 43rd day of the march, she came to him in the small hours, while the regiment camped among the skeletal remains of a manufactorum's inner halls. "You bound them," she said, "but now you must decide how long you will hold them." "What do you mean?" he asked. Her gaze was heavy. "The Covenant is not an unending river. It has a mouth, and one day it will open. When it does, you must choose whether they are to walk through into the void or remain and march forever. Eratheus said nothing. You will not know the right choice until the moment comes, she continued, and by then it will already be too late. She left without another word. The march continued. Cities fell around them, worlds burned, and through it all, the regiment of Cadia, bound in ash and oath, did not break. In the quiet moments between battles, Eratheus would find himself staring at their faces, wondering how many were still truly alive. The seer's prophecy hung over him like the unbroken shadow of a fortress wall. Somewhere ahead, the mouth of the river waited, and he feared what he might choose when he found it. The days after the bombardment were a hollow echo of life. The ground was still warm in places, fissures of molten stone bleeding faint heat into the air. A fine grey ash drifted constantly from the ruined sky, settling upon armour, upon the barrel of every laser gun, upon the silent lips of the dead. The Cadian 144th had not slept in 2 nights. Not truly. Their rest was the brittle collapse of bodies into the mud, waking moments later to the scream of distant artillery or the sharp crack of a falling beam. Captain Garin stood at the edge of the trench, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a dying city beyond. The spires of Creston were half gone now, broken teeth against a blood-orange horizon. Somewhere in those ruins, the enemy still moved, careful, quiet, like wolves. The bombardment had not driven them out. It had only stripped away the layers of defense until the last stand would be fought in the streets themselves. Behind him, the regiment gathered in a rough semicircle, their armour dulled by soot. Commissar Vale was there, her greatcoat immaculate despite the ruin, her hands clasped behind her back as if she stood at a parade ground instead of the front line. Her eyes were cold glass, unreadable in the half-light. 144th, she began, her voice carrying through the wind. Cadia is gone. The word struck like a bolt to the chest. They had all heard it whispered. Some had seen the augur reports, the shifting stars where the world should be. But to hear it spoken aloud was different. For a moment, no one moved. A few clenched fists, one soldier turning away as if to spit, though nothing came. Vale did not soften. But Cadia is more than rock and soil. It is the oath you swore. The Emperor still watches, and he does not forgive those who falter. Garen's jaw tightened. He remembered the oath clearly, the bitter taste of promethium smoke in the air that day, the sound of the fortress cannons firing in salute. Cadia stands. It had been a promise, not just to a planet, but to one another. We will hold this gate, Garen said, stepping forward, until our last breath, until there is nothing left of us but dust in the wind. Not because the Munitorum orders it, not because some distant Lord General wills it, but because we are Cadians. A murmur rose. Low, grim assent. Vale's gaze swept them. If you die here, your names will be remembered in the roll of the honoured dead. If you falter, you will vanish into the void, nameless, forgotten. It was not kindness, but it was truth, and in truth there was steel. From the north trench came the distant rattle of gunfire, sporadic, but close enough to remind them that time was a vanishing luxury. Garen gave the order, and the regiment began their preparations. Rations were divided into smaller portions, enough to last 4 days at most. Ammunition was counted with mechanical precision. No man or woman spoke unless necessary. Even their boots moved softly, as though the earth itself might break under too heavy a tread. By the time night fell, the ash storm had grown worse. The moons were pale smudges, Their light diffused into a dim, choking haze. Lanterns flickered behind makeshift barricades of rubble and torn plating. In one such hollow, Garen sat with Sergeant Calden, maps spread between them. "They'll come at dawn," Calden said, voice low. "They know the ash blinds us at night as much as it blinds them. But daylight, they'll want to see the kill." Garen's eyes traced the defensive lines, such as they were. Half the hab blocks marked as cover were already gone. The rest would fall within hours if the enemy pressed hard. "Then we hold until night again," Garen said. "And the next, and the next." Calden didn't argue, though his silence was heavy. In the dead of night, the oath was renewed, not in words, but in action. A young trooper named Merrick, barely more than a boy, stood his watch at the forward barricade. He had lost his brother 2 days before in the bombardment, and the grief had burned him into something harder, sharper. When a shadow moved at the edge of the ash, Merrick did not call out. He fired, the shot splitting the night. A scream answered, and then silence. He did not flinch, did not look back. That was the oath, unbroken, unbent. Elsewhere, Medicae Taris worked by the light of a single lumen, stitching a wound on a soldier who would not survive the hour. She whispered no prayers, for prayers were a luxury. She worked because it was the only defiance left. And in the command dugout, Commissar Vale etched each name of the fallen into her ledger, her script immaculate. She did not rush. Names were sacred, and each one was a promise kept. When the first horn sounded from the enemy lines, the 144th was ready. They rose as one from the trenches, laser guns snapping to shoulders. The ash swirled between them, carrying the scent of burning steel. Garen looked down the line, meeting eyes where he could. "Cardia stands," he said, not loudly, but with the weight of the world behind it. "Cardia stands," came the answer. One voice, 100 throats. The sky lit with the flash of the first volley. The battle had come, and beneath the ashen skies, the oath held firm. The battlefield was no longer a place of strategy or valor. It had become a crucible where the souls of men were tested and broken. Under the ashen skies, the 144th Cadian Regiment stood like statues carved from grit and sorrow, their faces smeared with soot and dried blood, their eyes reflecting the flames of destruction all around. Captain Garen moved through the ranks, his steps heavy, weighed down by the knowledge that every man beside him carried a story that would end here, if not tonight, then tomorrow, or the next day, in the endless grind of attrition. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of shattered promethium stores. Somewhere, the distant rumble of engines echoed, heralding the next wave of enemy assault. But this was no ordinary enemy. This was a force that did not fear death. Indeed, it seemed to welcome it. Shadowy figures lurked at the edges of the battlefield, moving silently like ghosts, striking with savage precision, then vanishing before counterfire could respond. Reports filtered through of troops disappearing from the lines, only to return hours later, eyes vacant, voices hoarse, speaking strange tongues no man dared understand. The men whispered the word Khorne with trembling lips, as if naming the darkness could summon it closer. Garen clenched his fists. He was a soldier of the Imperium, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the Emperor's justice. Yet here, in the ruins of a dying world, even those ideals seemed to fray, unraveling like the tatters of his once proud uniform. Commissar Vale approached him, her face unreadable beneath the shadow of her greatcoat hood. "Captain," she said quietly. The men are losing faith. They do not understand what they fight for anymore. The blood is endless, the deaths meaningless. Garen's gaze hardened. Faith is a weapon, Commissar. As long as they wield it, they will hold the line. She shook her head. Faith without hope is a blade that cuts its wielder. She reached into her coat and produced a small, blood-stained relic, a fragment of an ancient skull encased in adamantium. This was found in the ruins of the last stronghold. They say it belonged to a champion of Khorne himself. The mention of Khorne sent a chill down Garen's spine. The blood god was a myth whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy, a force of destruction and bloodlust that devoured worlds and souls alike. To find proof of his champions here was a terrifying omen. Garen took the relic, feeling the cold weight of it in his hand. Then we must show them what it means to stand against such darkness. The battle resumed with renewed fury. The enemy surged forward in waves, screaming war cries that seemed to pierce the very air. Lay's gun fire lit the night like a storm of stars, and the ground shook beneath the tread of war machines. Amidst the chaos, Garen fought with the desperate ferocity of a man who knows the end is near but refuses to yield. Suddenly, a scream rang out. A soldier down, clutching his chest where a jagged blade had pierced through armor. Garen pushed forward, drawing his chainsword, the teeth of which sang with the promise of death. He carved through foes with savage efficiency, but for every enemy that fell, 2 more took their place. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the relentless pounding of drums that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the battlefield. The drums of Khorne, calling for blood and skulls. As dawn approached, the field was littered with the bodies of the fallen, friend and foe alike. Garen stood atop a small mound, breathing heavily, his armor battered and stained. Around him, the surviving soldiers gathered, exhausted but unbroken. Commissar Vale approached once more. Captain, we have a choice. We can retreat and live to fight another day, or we can hold this ground and face certain death. Garen looked over the horizon, where the first light of the sun struggled to pierce the ashen clouds. The faces of his men, weary but resolute, flashed before his eyes. He knew that to retreat was to surrender not just ground, but hope. We stand, he said firmly. Cadia stands. The soldiers echoed the cry, their voices raw but unwavering. In that moment, Garen understood the true cost of their fight, not just the blood spilled, but the sacrifice of everything they held dear. The war was no longer just against the enemy, it was against despair itself. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the scarred earth, the 144th Cadian Regiment prepared to face the next wave of destruction, undaunted, unyielding, and bound by the unbreakable oath of loyalty and sacrifice. The weight of endless war pressed upon Captain Garen like a vice tightening with each passing day. The battlefield had become a living nightmare, a symphony of fire and ash, despair and defiance. Yet amid the ruin, something deeper gnawed at him, the slow erosion of his men's souls, worn down not only by bullets and bombs, but by the unseen enemy within. Nightfall found Garen alone in the shattered command bunker, its walls scarred with soot and engraved with the echoes of past commands. Outside, the ash continued to fall like bitter snow, muffling the distant sounds of marching feet and whispered prayers. The cold crept through the cracks in the concrete, chilling his bones even beneath his layered armor. He stared into the flickering holomap that marked the thin red lines of their remaining defenses, fractured but unbroken. Somewhere beyond those lines, the darkness stirred, hungry and relentless. The rumors among his officers whispered of forces not just mortal, of demonic pacts and ancient powers that corrupted the minds of men faster than any virus or toxin. Garen's thoughts returned to the relic Commissar Vale had shown him, the fragment of a skull said to belong to a champion of Khorne. It was more than a token. It was a warning etched in bone. He had seen the signs. Soldiers who had once been stalwart, now seized by uncontrollable rage, eyes burning with a fever that no medic could cure. Men who whispered prayers not to the Emperor, but to a red god of war and carnage. The line between devotion and damnation blurred like the ash in the wind. Footsteps echoed behind him, and Garen turned to see Vale entering silently, her expression grave beneath the hood. "They grow restless," she said. "The men, the officers, even the commanders." She produced a small data slate, flickering with reports of insubordination, unexplained violence, and disappearances. Garen rubbed his face, exhaustion etched deep into his features. The line holds, but the price is high. If the men break, all is lost. Vale stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There is talk of a ritual, one to bind their spirits. The Ashseer's covenant has spread through the ranks, but it is not enough. Some say the blood must be spilled willingly, offered to the Red God if we are to stand." The implication was poison in the air. Garen felt a cold dread settle over him. Sacrifice, true sacrifice, was the currency of chaos, not the Imperium. And yet the desperation was clear. "Have you seen this with your own eyes?" he asked. Vale nodded. "More than once. Soldiers who once fought with honor now take lives recklessly, shouting the name Khorne in battle. We fight not just the enemy outside, but the enemy within." Garen's fist slammed against the table. "Then we must root it out, purge the rot before it spreads." Vale's eyes hardened. "And if the rot is not within the men, but within the very soil they walk upon?" Garen did not answer. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. In the following days, the 144th battles grew bloodier, the enemy's assaults more savage and cunning. Garen noticed that the tide of battle seemed to ebb and flow not with strategy, but with a brutal, chaotic rhythm, as if the forces opposing them were being driven by something far older, far darker. One evening, Garen visited the forward lines himself. The men were scarred, faces haunted by exhaustion and loss. He paused beside a squad huddled in a crumbling ruin. One soldier, Private Meris, was trembling, clutching his lasgun as if it might shatter in his hands. "You're afraid," Garen said quietly. Meris nodded, eyes wide. "I hear the drums. At night. Always the drums." Garen swallowed hard. The drums were the call of Khorne, an echo from the warp that could twist the mind, harden the heart, and drown out reason with bloodlust. "We stand because we must," Garen said, voice low but steady. "Because the Emperor watches, because we are Cadian." The men looked to him, searching for hope in his words. But Garen knew hope was a fragile thing, and the night was far from over. Back in the command bunker, Garen sat before a battered datapad, reading the transcripts of intercepted enemy communications. Among the chaos, one name surfaced repeatedly: Zarek the Blood Herald, a warlord whispered to command legions of twisted warriors, said to be touched by the blood god himself. The name sent a chill down Garen's spine. Vale joined him once more, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Zarek leads them, then this war is far from mortal. It is a war of gods. Garen closed his eyes, the weight of his duty pressing down harder than ever. To fight a mortal enemy was a hardship. To fight a god was madness. Then we prepare, he said, not just for survival, but for damnation. As the ash fell steadily like morning snow, the 144th held fast. But Garen felt the cracks growing. Within the regiment, within himself, within the very fabric of the war. And beneath it all, the drums beat on. The skies above Crestholm had turned to ash and blood. The dying sun bled crimson through the haze, casting long, twisted shadows over a world undone. The once proud spires of the manufactorum shattered like broken teeth, blackened and jagged against the endless storm clouds that churned above. Captain Garen stood atop a mound of rubble, his armor scorched and battered, his breath ragged but unyielding. The weight of command pressed upon him heavier than the chainsword at his side. Around him, the remnants of the 144th Cadian Regiment held their ground, their faces pale and drawn, eyes sunken from weeks without rest. They were soldiers forged in the furnace of endless war. Yet even their resolve was fraying beneath the shadow of the blood god's drums. It began as a whisper. Voices among the men, low murmurs in the dark, spoke of a figure who had appeared in the midst of the battle. A warrior clad in blackened brass and stained crimson, wielding a glaive that seemed forged from the very essence of rage. They called him Zarak, the Blood Herald. He was no mere man. Wherever he strode, the earth cracked and bled. His eyes glowed with a fire that burned away hope itself. Soldiers claimed they heard the pounding of war drums wherever he walked, a sound that seeped into their minds and shattered their will. The regiment's chaplains spoke of corruption. The officers whispered of despair. Even Commissar Vale's steely gaze faltered when the name Zarak was uttered. But Garen would not allow fear to consume them. He gathered the commanders beneath a crumbling archway, the glow of distant fires painting their faces in hellish light. "We face more than men," he said. "We face a force that feeds on death, chaos, and bloodlust. Zarak is a herald of that force. We must not let him break our line." Lieutenant Merrick, once a boy barely grown, now a man hardened by war, stepped forward. "Captain," the men falter. The drums in their minds grow louder. Some speak of visions, blood rivers, endless skulls. They fear the pact they've made. Garen's jaw tightened. The covenant binds us, but it is our will that must master the blood, not the other way around. We will stand, or we will fall with honor. The words did not carry comfort, yet they were all they had. That night, the nightmare came. The enemy launched a devastating assault, fury incarnate. Flames licked the skies as war engines roared, spewing death in torrents. Garen's men fought with desperate valor, but the tide of battle was turning against them. In the midst of chaos, Zarak appeared. He moved like a spectre through the battlefield, cleaving down soldiers with ruthless grace. His glaive sang a song of death, carving arcs of crimson through the air. Wherever he went, the ground seemed to burn beneath his feet, and those who looked upon him felt their hearts harden with savage bloodlust. Garen faced him at last, amidst the ruins of a shattered command post. The air between them crackled with the heat of their opposing wills. "Your war ends here, Blood Herald," Garen declared, raising his chainsword. Zarak's laugh was a cruel thunder. "This war never ends, mortal. It is the eternal dance of blood and bone. You cannot escape it." They clashed, metal biting metal, the sound echoing like thunder across the desolation. Garen fought with every ounce of his strength, every memory of his oath driving his blade. Yet Zarak was no ordinary foe. Each strike he parried, each wound he shrugged off, as if fueled by the very fury that consumed the battlefield. In the heat of battle, a truth dawned upon Garen. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a war for the soul of every man who stood beneath the ashen sky. As dawn broke, the battlefield lay silent but scorched. The 144th had held, but at great cost. The line was shattered, the dead piled like monuments to sacrifice. Garen stood among the ruins, gaze drifting to where Zarak had vanished into the mists. Commissar Vale approached, her voice barely a whisper. "The Blood Herald will return. His presence is a curse upon this world." Garen nodded slowly, the weight of the future settling upon him like a shroud. "Then we prepare, not just our weapons, but our minds." In the days that followed, whispers of betrayal began to seep through the ranks. Some commanders questioned Garen's resolve. Others spoke of secret deals made in shadow. The line between ally and enemy blurred as paranoia spread. And beneath it all, the drums beat on, unceasing, unrelenting, a summons to blood and ruin. The air was thick with suspicion. Trust, once the bedrock of the 144th Cadian Regiment, now lay fractured beneath the weight of whispered rumours and dark secrets. The ashen skies above Crestholm offered no solace, only a cold, grey light that seemed to leach hope from the weary souls beneath it. Captain Garen moved through the shattered trenches with measured steps, his eyes sharp for signs of unrest. Every glance, every muttered word was a potential fault line. He had fought countless battles against Xenos, heretics, and demons, but none had tested him like this slow corrosion of loyalty from within. Commissar Vale met him in the command post, her expression grave as she unfurled a data slate. "We have intercepted a communication," she said quietly, voice edged with bitterness. "A faction within our own ranks has begun talks with the enemy. They seek to bargain for survival at any cost." Garen's fist clenched. Treachery. Who? The sergeants, several officers. The men are broken, desperate. They see no end to this war but death. They offer our enemies keys to our defences in exchange for mercy. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Garen swallowed hard, his mind racing through faces, friends, brothers in arms, now shadows behind the veil of deceit. "We root them out," Garen said with cold resolve. "We burn the rot from the heart of the regiment." Under the cover of night, Garen convened a secret tribunal. The accused were brought forth, eyes wide with fear and defiance. The flickering torchlight cast long, shadows that danced like spectres across their faces. One by one, confessions spilled forth, words laced with regret and terror. The enemy's promise was simple: survival in exchange for surrender. But Garen knew no price was too high to betray the Emperor's trust. Among the accused was Sergeant Kale, a veteran whose valour in battle had once been unquestioned. His hands trembled as he spoke. "We are but men, Captain. The endless blood, it crushes the spirit. We seek only to live, to see another dawn." Garen's eyes burned with pain. Life without honour is death in the Emperor's eyes. The tribunal's verdict was swift and unforgiving. Those who betrayed the oath were cast out or executed, their names erased from the rolls, their memories left to rot. Yet even as the traitors fell, a deeper darkness grew. Whispers spread that Zarak's influence reached beyond the battlefield, into dreams, into thoughts. Men awoke screaming of crimson rivers, of skull thrones, of an endless war where victory was the scent of blood spilled and souls consumed. Private Meris, who had once trembled at the drums, now stood rigid, eyes glazed as if caught between worlds. He spoke of visions, of voices urging him to embrace the fury, to become a vessel of the blood god's will. Garen sought him out in the ruins of an old chapel. The young soldier's hands were stained with fresh blood, not from wounds, but from self-inflicted cuts. "Meris," Garen said softly, "this is not the way." Meris looked up, voice hollow. "They call me. The drums never stop. I can hear them beneath my skin. They say that only in the fury can we find true freedom." Garen knelt, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. True freedom lies not in rage, but in the strength to choose. The Emperor gives us that strength. But Meris shook his head, retreating into the shadows where the firelight could not reach. The days bled into one another, the regiment's cohesion fraying as fear and madness took root. Garen's leadership was challenged not just by the enemy without, but by the war within. In a desperate council, Garen and Vale debated their next move. "We cannot hold these lines forever," Vale said grimly. "If Zarek's shadow spreads, we lose not just this battle, but ourselves." Garen's gaze was unyielding. "Then we strike at the heart. We find Zarak and end this nightmare." Vale nodded slowly. "It is a gamble, but a necessary one." As preparations began for a daring assault into the enemy's stronghold, Garen found himself haunted by the faces of those lost, not just to death, but to betrayal and madness. He stood once more beneath the ashen sky, the drums faint, but ever present. Somewhere in the distance, the warlord Zarak awaited, an embodiment of fury and ruin. The final act was approaching. The line between loyalty and corruption, between life and death, would soon be crossed. And in the heart of the storm, only one question remained. Who would survive the wrath of Khorne? The night stretched like a living thing over the scarred plains of Crestholm, thick with the stench of blood and burning promethium. The stars were long extinguished behind a veil of ash, and even the moon seemed to mourn in silence. Amid the ruins, the 144th Cadian Regiment prepared for the assault that might decide their fate, or their doom. Captain Garen stood before his assembled commanders, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion and dread. The weight of countless losses had carved deep lines into their features, but none bore it heavier than Garen himself. His eyes were sharp, burning with a grim resolve forged in the crucible of endless war. "The enemy's heart lies in the old manufactorum," Garen began, voice low but steady. "Zarak awaits within those walls. We cannot afford hesitation or mercy." Lieutenant Merrick, now hardened beyond his years, nodded. "We strike at dawn, swift and ruthless. No room for error." As the final plans took shape, Garen's mind wandered to the men who would follow him into the jaws of death. Faces haunted by loss, by fear, and by a hope that seemed ever more fragile. The drums, those relentless, maddening drums, beat in the distance, a constant reminder of the god they defied. The assault began before the first light of dawn. The 144th moved through the broken streets, their footsteps muffled beneath layers of ash. The enemy was waiting, shadows flickering in ruined corridors, strikes that came swift and deadly. Amid the chaos, Zarak appeared. His presence was a wound in the fabric of reality, fury made flesh. Clad in armor black as the void, stained with the blood of 1,000 battles, he wielded his glaive like a reaper's scythe. The very air seemed to shudder with the rhythm of his war drums. Garen met him in the heart of the manufactorum, where machinery lay broken and silent beneath a blood-red sky. Their clash was a tempest of metal and will, each strike a thunderclap that shook the ground beneath them. "You fight well, Captain," Zarek sneered, voice like grinding iron, "but your soul is already claimed." Garen gritted his teeth. "My soul belongs to the Emperor. Yours is damned." They fought with savage grace, each blow a testament to their convictions, one of loyalty, the other of bloodlust. As the duel raged, a darker betrayal unfolded. From the shadows, Sergeant Kyle, once condemned, now released in desperation, struck. His blade found Garen's side, sharp and merciless. The pain blossomed, red and searing, but Garen did not falter. "You betrayed your brothers," Garen growled, clutching the wound. "For what? Survival? Madness?" Kyle's eyes were wild, lost to the whispers of Khorne. "I seek freedom, in the fury." Garen's chainsword roared to life, but the moment was shattered as Zarek seized the opportunity, driving the captain back with a savage blow. Wounded and betrayed, Garen struggled to rise. Around him, the battle spiraled into chaos, brothers fighting brothers, loyalty unraveling in a storm of blood and fury. Commissar Vale appeared, her voice a beacon amidst the madness. "Hold the line. Remember the oath." But even her iron will could not stem the tide of betrayal. Soldiers torn between duty and the corrupting call of Khorne turned their weapons on one another. In the end, the manufactorum became a tomb, its walls soaked with the blood of heroes and traitors alike. As Garen's vision faded, he saw Zarek looming, victorious, but hollow. The Blood Herald's war drums echoed louder than ever, promising an unending war of blood and ruin. In his final breath, Garen whispered a vow, not of surrender, but of defiance. The war was not over. The shattered manufactorum lay silent beneath the bloodied sky, a tomb for the brave and the broken. The fires of war had burned low, leaving behind only smouldering ruins and the heavy scent of death. The name of Captain Garen, once spoken with hope and honor, was now whispered in tones weighed with sorrow and bitter regret. Commissar Vale stood among the remnants of the 144th Cadian Regiment, her figure stark against the haze of ash and smoke. Her greatcoat flapped like a dark banner in the cold wind as she surveyed the devastation. The survivors, few and fractured, gathered around her, their faces etched with exhaustion and haunted by memories of betrayal. The war had ended, but at a cost that no victory could justify. Vale's gaze fell upon the blood-stained relic, the fragment of skull that had haunted their campaign, a symbol of the god who had driven them to the brink of madness. It was a grim reminder of the price paid when mortal men dared to stand against forces beyond reckoning. Captain Garen fell not only to the enemy, but to the poison within, she said quietly. His sacrifice was noble, but the seeds of corruption had taken root. One of the surviving officers, Lieutenant Merrick, stepped forward, his expression grave. "What now?" "The regiment is broken, our honor shattered." Vale's eyes hardened. "We rebuild, but with caution. The whispers of Khorne still linger in the shadows, and the scars of betrayal will not fade with time." The days that followed were marked by mourning and reflection. The men buried their dead beneath the ash, their prayers a fragile bulwark against despair. Yet the wounds were deeper than flesh. They were etched into the soul of the regiment. Stories spread of survivors haunted by nightmares, their minds forever touched by the drums that once beckoned them to fury. Some spoke of dreams where they stood amidst rivers of blood, where the faces of fallen comrades twisted into masks of rage and sorrow. The cost of immortality, the eternal, witness to the fall of all they held dear, was a torment few could bear. Vale convened a council beneath the shattered dome of the command bunker. The survivors gathered, their voices low and heavy with the weight of loss. "We have seen the price of defiance against the blood god," Vale began. "But we must remember why we fight, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for the Emperor's vision of order." Lieutenant Merrick spoke, his voice steady despite the anguish. "We have lost more than men. We have lost ourselves. To reclaim what remains, we must confront the darkness within." Vale nodded. "The path forward is uncertain, but we endure. For Cadia, for the Emperor, for those who cannot fight anymore." As the survivors prepared to leave Crestholm, the ash settled slowly, like a shroud over a world left to mourn. The war was over, but the shadow of Khorne's fury would linger, an eternal reminder of the thin line between loyalty and madness. Captain Garen's legacy endured, not in victories or banners, but in the memory of sacrifice and the unyielding struggle against despair. The drums may never cease, but neither would the resolve of those who stood against them. The echoes of the shattered manufactorum at Crestholm reached far beyond the ash-choked skies of that forsaken world. News of the 144th Cadian Regiment's devastation, the fall of Captain Garen, and the rise of the Blood Herald Zarek spread like wildfire through the corridors of Imperial Command. Yet, even as whispers of despair grew louder, the machinery of war churned onward, indifferent to loss and sacrifice. In the shadowed halls of the Segmentum Command, Admiral Vors stood before a massive viewport, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond. His face was a map of scars and hard-earned wisdom, the weight of command etched deeply in every line. "Reports confirm the fall of Crestholm's manufactorum, Admiral," his aide reported, voice trembling slightly. "The 144th is shattered. Zarek's influence grows." Vorsk's eyes narrowed. "The blood god's hand moves like a plague across the frontier. We cannot allow this to spread." Far from the war-torn front, in the catacombs beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, Inquisitor Malcador convened a council of the highest order. The chamber was draped in shadows, illuminated only by the flicker of ancient reliquaries. The weight of the Imperium's survival pressed heavy on every soul present. "We face an enemy not merely of flesh, but of spirit," Malcador intoned. "Zarek and his host are vessels of Khorne's rage, fueled by the madness that festers within men." A voice broke the solemn silence. "Is there hope?" asked Magos Dominus Helran, his mechanical limbs whirring softly. Malcador's gaze was steely. "Hope is a weapon. We must wield it with care, lest it become folly. The corruption must be purged, but not at the cost of our own souls." Back on the shattered worlds, remnants of the 144th Cadian Regiment struggled to find purpose amidst ruin. Lieutenant Merrick, now the reluctant leader of the survivors, bore the scars of battle and betrayal alike. His nights were haunted by visions, the incessant drums, the blood-red skies, and the haunting laughter of Zarak. In whispered conversations with Commissar Vale, Merrick confessed his fears. "The men look to me for guidance, but I am not sure I have the strength. The shadow of Khorne clings to us all." Vale's response was unwavering. "Strength is not the absence of doubt, but the resolve to fight despite it. We rebuild from ashes, or we perish trying." The war was no longer a matter of lines on a map, but of the soul itself. Across the war-torn sector, Imperial forces braced for the storm that Zarek heralded, a tempest of blood, fury, and ruin. And in the void between stars, the drums of Khorne thundered ever louder. The void was a black ocean, endless and merciless, swallowing the flickering light of the warship Emperor's Wrath as it pierced the boundary of the Crestholm system. Inside its armored hull, a fragile hope clung to life, a hope born of defiance amid despair and the stubborn will of those who refused to yield. Lieutenant Merrick stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon where the ruined planet awaited. The weight of command settled on his shoulders like a suffocating shroud. Around him, the crew moved with mechanical precision, each man and woman a cog in the vast machine of war. "Enemy forces are massing below," reported the tactical officer, his voice steady despite the tension. "Zarek's legions prepare to strike again." Merrick's jaw tightened. "They will find us ready." Below, on the planet's scarred surface, Commissar Vale rallied the remnants of the 144th Cadian Regiment. Their numbers were few, their spirits battered, but their resolve burned brighter than ever. "The drums of Khorne seek to drown our will," Vale proclaimed, her voice ringing clear amid the ruined cathedral. "But we stand as the Emperor's shield. Let our enemies hear the cry of loyalty and steel." The men responded with a roar that shook the heavens, a fierce promise carved from sacrifice and unyielding faith. Yet even as preparations were made for the impending storm, doubt gnawed at Merrick's mind. The betrayal that had shattered their ranks lingered like a festering wound. How many more voices whispered Khorne's name in the dark? How many more hands were poised to strike from within? Late one night, Merrick sought out Vale beneath the shattered vaults. Their conversation was hushed, laden with unspoken fears. "Zarek's shadow is long," Vale admitted, "and the blood God's whispers reach even the strongest minds." Merrick's voice was low. "How do we fight an enemy that lives in our thoughts?" Vale's eyes were fierce. "By remembering who we are, by holding fast to the light in the darkness." As the Emperor's wrath descended toward the planet, a storm of fire and fury erupted. Zarek's forces surged like a tidal wave, relentless and merciless. The battle was chaos incarnate. Blades clashed with bolters, screams pierced the roar of explosions, and the air was thick with smoke and blood. Yet amidst the maelstrom, the soldiers of the 144th fought with the desperate courage of those who know this might be their last stand. Merrick found himself face to face with a fallen brother, Sergeant Kyle, his eyes wild with frenzy, sword raised not against the enemy, but his own comrades. "Kyle," Merrick shouted, struggling to reach the man beneath the madness. "Remember who you are." But Kyle's scream was a howl of fury, his blade swinging with deadly intent. The clash was brutal and heartbreaking. Merrick's chainsword tore through the frenzy, but the cost was etched into his soul. He stood amidst the ruin, bloodied and breathless, as the drums thundered louder than ever. The battle was far from over. The fires of war raged unchecked across the blasted plains of Crestholm, a hellscape where the cries of the living were drowned beneath the relentless drums of Khorne. The sky itself seemed aflame, burning red and black, casting a hellish glow over the dying embers of hope. Lieutenant Merrick moved through the carnage like a spectre, his armor stained with the blood of comrades and foes alike. Each step weighed heavy with the burden of command and the ghosts of betrayal that haunted his every breath. The once proud 144th Cadian Regiment was little more than a shattered remnant, torn by war and the insidious rot that festered within their ranks. Amid the chaos, Merrick's mind was a tempest of doubt and determination. The blood herald Zarek still prowled the battlefield, a living avatar of rage and destruction, and every blow he struck seemed to chip away at the thin line between loyalty and madness. In the heart of the ruined manufactorum, Merrick found himself face to face with the embodiment of that madness. Zarek stood tall, a colossus clad in blackened brass, his glaive dripping with the blood of countless souls. His war drums thundered in rhythm with the pounding of Merrick's heart. "You fight for a lost cause," Zarek spat, voice a cruel echo of thunder. "Your defiance is meaningless. Bow before the fury of Khorne and find release in the blood." Merrick raised his chainsword, the hum of the blade a whisper against the roaring war. "I fight for the Emperor, for those who cannot." Their clash was cataclysmic, a storm of fury and steel that shook the very foundations of the world. Each strike Merrick delivered was a plea for redemption, a desperate grasp at the fraying threads of hope. But as the battle raged, the true betrayal unfolded. From the Yav shadows emerged Commissar Vale, her eyes cold and unyielding, yet shadowed with pain. She raised her bolt pistol, not at the enemy, but at Merrick. "This ends now," she said, voice hard as the blade she once wielded. Merrick staggered, disbelief flooding his senses. "Vale, why?" Her gaze was unwavering. "Because you faltered. You let the rot grow. The blood god's corruption spreads through you." Betrayed and bewildered, Merrick raised his chainsword in defense. Their confrontation was swift and tragic, a clash of wills born from loyalty twisted by despair. Vale's shots tore through his armor, but Merrick fought on, driven by a resolve that refused to break. As the duel reached its crescendo, Zarek watched with cruel amusement, the drums of Khorne echoing like the final dirge of the damned. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the outcome of this bitter betrayal. In the end, it was not Zarek's glaive but Vale's bullet that found its mark. Merrick collapsed, blood pooling beneath him like the ashes of a dying star. With his last breath, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the souls lost to the endless fury. The manufactorum fell silent, save for the fading echoes of the war drums. The price of loyalty and betrayal had been paid in full, and amid the ruins, the shadow of Khorne loomed ever larger. The blood-soaked air of Crestholm hung heavy with silence, a brief reprieve in a war that had become a symphony of violence and despair. The sky, once ablaze with the fires of battle, now bore the bruised hues of twilight, shadows stretching long over the ruined manufactorum that had witnessed so much sacrifice. Commissar Vale stood alone amid the desolation, her breath steady, but her heart a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The weight of her choice pressed upon her like the gravest of sins. She had struck down Lieutenant Merrick, the last beacon of hope within the shattered 144th. But in doing so, had she extinguished their last chance at salvation? Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the distant rumble of war drums still echoed faintly, a reminder that the blood god's hunger was never sated. In the days that followed, Vale assumed command, her resolve tempered by grief and hardened by necessity. The survivors rallied beneath her, their numbers diminished, but their spirits unbroken. They were warriors forged by fire and betrayal, bound by an unspoken oath to resist the corruption that threatened to consume them. Yet even as they prepared to make their final stand, shadows gathered within their ranks. Whispers of dissent and fear festered like wounds refusing to heal. The drums called still, and the promise of fury offered a dark solace to those teetering on the edge of madness. Veil's leadership was tested as never before, not by the enemy without, but by the fragile bonds within. The climactic battle came beneath a sky streaked with blood-red lightning, the heavens torn by the fury of the gods. Veil led her forces into the heart of the enemy's domain, every step a testament to the iron will that refused to yield. Zarek awaited, towering and terrible, the very incarnation of wrath. His glaive sang a deadly hymn as he charged, war drums thundering a relentless cadence that shook the earth. Veil met him with cold fury, her bolt pistol and power sword cutting a path through the storm. The clash was brutal and merciless, a dance of death where every moment might be the last. Amid the swirling chaos, Veil glimpsed the faces of those she had lost, Garen, Merrick, the countless souls consumed by the endless war. Their memories fueled her strikes, a bittersweet fire that burned away doubt. With a final, thunderous blow, she shattered Zarek's glaive, sending shards of blood-stained metal scattering across the battlefield. The war drums faltered, their rhythm broken. Zarek fell to his knees, eyes blazing with rage and disbelief. "This is not the end," he growled, voice like a death knell. "The fury will return." Veil raised her sword, a silent vow etched into the shadows. "Then we will be ready." As dawn broke over the ravaged world, the survivors gathered among the ruins, bloodied but unbowed. The war was won, but at a cost that would echo through the ages. Veil's thoughts lingered on the fragile line between loyalty and betrayal, on the sacrifices that had carved their path through darkness. The drums might beat again, but the flame of resistance burned still. The sun rose weak and pale over the shattered world of Crestholm, its light struggling to pierce the thick veil of ash and smoke that clung to the sky like a funeral shroud. The once proud manufactorum, now a ruin of twisted steel and scorched stone, whispered the final echoes of a war that had consumed generations. Commissar Veil stood at the edge of the battlefield, her armor dented and stained, her gaze heavy with the weight of countless sacrifices. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the thunderous drums that had once filled the air, a fading heartbeat of the blood god's wrath. Around her, the survivors of the 144th Cadian Regiment moved like ghosts, hollowed by grief but unbroken in spirit. They had faced madness and betrayal, walked the razor's edge between loyalty and despair, and emerged battered but unyielding. Veil's thoughts drifted to those lost. Captain Garen, the steadfast pillar who had held them against the storm. Lieutenant Merrick, whose courage was extinguished by the bitterest of betrayals, and the countless souls consumed by the endless hunger of Khorne. Their memories were scars etched upon her heart, reminders of the cost of defiance. Yet amid the ruin, a quiet truth had taken root. The price of immortality was not only endless battle, but the eternal burden of remembrance. To live was to witness the rise and fall of empires, the turning of ages, and the slow decay of all things beloved. The drums may have fallen silent here, but their echo reverberated across the stars, a relentless summons to blood and fury. The galaxy was a tapestry of endless conflict, where gods clashed and mortals danced on the edge of oblivion. Veil understood that this battle was but a single thread in the vast weave of war. The legacy of Crestholm would endure, not in triumph or glory, but in the solemn vow of those who bore its scars. She lowered her gaze to the shattered ground, where fallen banners lay half buried in ash, and whispered a prayer to the Emperor, a plea for strength, for mercy, and for the grace to carry on. As the survivors turned away from the ruins, their footsteps stirring the dust of ages, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. It was a fragile promise, of endings and beginnings intertwined, of loss and the flickering hope that follows. Commissar Vale's voice broke the silence, steady and resolute. The war is not over, but as long as we remember our courage, our sacrifices, the spirit of the Emperor will never die. The drums of Khorne may beat still in the dark, but in the hearts of those who stand against the fury, a flame burns eternal. The end.